This is the second in our video series about Medicare for All. In this video, we're going to talk about what Medicare for All may or may not do to the U.S. economy. Before we get started, we're going to have to do some framing here. We're going to talk about some really big numbers, billions and trillions of dollars. And those numbers get so big that they're hard to really wrap your mind around. So let's convert them into something that's easier to understand. Time. 1 million seconds is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 years. 1 trillion seconds is 31,700 years. Okay, that helps gives you some perspective on how much bigger a trillion is than a billion. All right, keep that in mind. All right, let's take a look at healthcare in the U.S. economy. The healthcare in the U.S. economy today chews up almost 18% of gross domestic product. Almost 1 out of every $5 we spend in this country for anything goes for the provision of healthcare. It's $3.5 trillion a year. Another way to put that in perspective is if our healthcare economy were its own country and its own GDP or gross domestic product, it would be the 5th largest country in the world. Okay, we spend more money on healthcare in this country than all but 4 other countries spend on everything. It's big. Okay, so what happens if we convert from our current system to where the government pays for all healthcare and healthcare for all? Well, to a large part, that depends on how much money the government pays for things. Are they going to pay for things at a different level than what they're currently being reimbursed? So, I'm a good economist. I like to neutralize as many variables as possible. Let's assume that the government pays exactly the same amount and that there isn't any increase in utilization by having everybody get free healthcare. Both incredibly flawed assumptions. But let's go ahead and neutralize those variables and talk about what would happen in that scenario. So in that scenario, the government, which currently buys about 45% of all the healthcare consumed, would suddenly start being the purchaser for 100% of healthcare consumed. That means the government would have to find another $1.96 trillion a year to cover that cost. The federal government's budget would increase by almost $2 trillion a year. Again, that assumes that they pay the same level and that there's no sudden increase in utilization. Both flawed assumptions. So how are they going to come up with another $2 trillion? Well, taxation. It's really the only way to get that money. And it would be a combination of taxation on employers, corporations, and individuals. Now, I understand the argument that if you're going to reduce an employer's expense by getting rid of their cost of healthcare, that they can afford to pay more taxes. Absolutely, I get it. I get the argument that if you're going to reduce the expense on an individual, then they should pay more in income taxes. They're getting something for free. We're just converting what got paid out of their paycheck or out of the corporate coffers into a tax. That all makes sense. The problem becomes is that it creates incentives. Healthcare became a employer-financed event or case largely because of incentives based on World War II and a short labor supply, and they got a tax break for doing it. So now it'll change those incentives. So what happens to jobs? What happens to corporations that now have a much more significant incentive to move jobs offshore, to move money to other countries where it wouldn't be taxed as high? What about that small employer that didn't cover health insurance for their employees? Are they going to have to pay the tax too, or is it only on big employers? What about those individuals that are suddenly getting healthcare for free but are below the tax line? So they weren't paying any tax anyway. Are you going to start taxing them now? These are incredibly difficult questions that could have ramifications that are wide-reaching on the U.S. economy. Based on how they create these tax pools or tax funding mechanisms, could significantly incentivize individuals or corporations to change their behavior. The big question for me isn't whether or not you can finance this through taxes or any of that stuff. It's, does this really do anything to handle the fundamental problem of healthcare trending? The problem with healthcare is this. It's more than just that it's a lot of money. It keeps getting worse. It's like bleeding that not only doesn't stop, it keeps getting worse. At some point, you got to deal with it. Let me tell you what I mean by that. In 1970 in this country, we paid $74 billion for healthcare. $74 billion. By the year 2000, we were up to $1.4 trillion. So from 1970 to year 2000, over 3 decades, our appetite for healthcare increased by $44 billion a year. It's not an insignificant number. But if you look at from the year 2000 to the year 2017, we went from 1.4 trillion to 3.5 trillion. That's a rate of over $300 billion a year. Ladies and gentlemen, we're falling out of the sky and gaining speed and momentum on the way. That's the problem. Simply changing who's going to finance it in and of itself doesn't address that trend. And that's the stuff that's really going to kill us. So what would happen to the economy in a Medicare for all? Not quite sure. It depends on how the details are handled, how the financing mechanisms handle, and how payment gets handled and how providers get paid, etc. All that stuff is still way up in the air. But I'll leave you with this. Economists like to talk about ceteris paribus, Latin phrase meaning all other things being held equal, which means as economists, we like to say, well, let's forget about all these other factors, all these other things that could happen, and let's just say that they stay the same and we only adjust one variable. Well, that's the problem with economists. That never happens. Anytime you start messing around with a vibrant, dynamic economy, other things happen. You can't push on one side of the balloon and not have the other part of the balloon go up. So the big question is, when we start pushing on the largest segment of the U.S. economy, where's it going to go? And if we're wrong, this could make the housing crisis of '08 look minuscule, because healthcare is much bigger and could have a much bigger impact on our economy. Thank you.